Lisa received a PhD in chemistry and biochemistry from the University of California in Santa Cruz in 2015. And she has nearly a decade of experience utilizing synthetic chemistry and biochemistry. And in 2015, she joined the Consortium for Drug Resistance Gram-Negative Pathogen Detection at UC Berkeley, and was awarded a Supplemental National of Health Fellowship to develop the core technology that inspired the inception of biohem diagnostic. And I'm sure you will talk about that. And so with that, I let you present your work.
Great. Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen real quick. Yeah, I also put a couple of slides together. I think this will complement kind of what Lisa had already talked about. So hi, everybody. You can see my screen, okay? Celine, can you see screen? Okay, great. Awesome. So I'm going to talk about navigating the diagnostic product market. This is something that the market opportunities, like we were just talking about, and how you think about developing tests that are going to ultimately lead to clinically impactful tests, but then also something that's going to be feasible from a company standpoint, right? We want to be putting more innovative diagnostics into the pipeline and into development, and to do that, you do need to think about many different components. And so I'll kind of just touch upon them today to hopefully start helping you think about what we think about at BioAmp Diagnostics in terms of how we're developing tests to ultimately be able to drive innovation in the diagnostic sector. So I'm only going to talk very briefly about BioAmp because we're not specifically in the COVID space, although there is a huge overuse of antibiotics right now in this patient population specifically, so we're quite interested in it. But BioAmp, what we're working on is focusing efforts towards creating rapid point-of-care tests for directing care and appropriate use of antibiotics for many different types of infections, first focusing on urinary tract infections. So we actually use a non-PCR based colorimetric system to be able to decrease time to results of traditional clinical microbiology that's shown on the top here, using a simple chemistry reagent that is utilizing existing instrumentation that's already found in clinical labs, larger clinical labs, to ultimately be able to direct care of patients that are experiencing higher risk urinary tract infections. So if you have any questions about that, we can talk about it later. But more, I wanted to talk about the complexities of creating a diagnostic and the way that the healthcare system in the US and around the world really impacts the market of diagnostics. And so there are a whole number of stakeholders that we have to consider as a diagnostic company. We have providers and physicians, we have clinical labs, central labs, people that are in charge of actually managing point of care diagnostics and all of diagnostics in a hospital system. You have hospital administration, those that are in charge of bringing on new tests and helping, you have to be able to prove to them that the test is worth bringing it on, training the whole staff, being able to create the infrastructure that's needed to launch a new test in a hospital. You have payers, you have insurers, right, that you ultimately have to interface with to make sure that the hospitals are going to get paid for the tests that they're doing, that you're trying to get them to use. And you have regulatory bodies, right? This is a very simplified picture of this, but there's many stakeholders and diagnostic companies. I think people underappreciate the number of factors that we're always having to weigh to ultimately get a product to impact patient care. And so today I'm going to focus more on the providers, central labs, and the hospital administration, because it's easy to think about a problem, right? COVID is a very distinct problem. As Lisa mentioned, there's lots of different segments of like use cases in diagnostics, and ultimately we can create technologies. But that ends up not being the bottleneck. A lot of times it ends up being implementation, adoption, and scaling. And so you can have a provider, tell you, I want this kind of test. You can go and build it. But ultimately, you still need to get clearance from multiple agencies along the way. And I'm taking regulatory out of this, right? To be able to launch a successful product and help those providers. And so if you think about the way that, so this is what we think about at BioAmp quite a bit, is in the US specifically. I'm focusing much more there because we are located in the US and we know a lot more about this space. You kind of break down different segments of the healthcare system as providers, labs, and hospital administration. And you have a whole number of activities that you have to make sure that you account for in the development of your test. Because at the end of the day, you can create a wonderful test, but if you can never get it adopted, it's never going to impact patient care. So the things which I really appreciate the fact that for the hackathon, there's an emphasis on figuring out exactly how you're going to end-to-end get your product into use, your diagnostic into use, because it's one of the biggest hurdles actually for diagnostic companies. It's not building the technology, it's actually thinking about all these other logistical components. And so you think about use cases, if you go back to Lisa's example, let's give you a picture of, if you picture in your head UCSF Medical Center versus a small clinic in rural area of California, the infrastructure that they have are so uniquely different that the tests that you might develop for them could be different as well. Because if you look at UCSF, they have these huge automated systems, and maybe they don't want to actually have a near patient test. They want a bigger screening facility, right? Versus a rural hospital that's not going to have that type of infrastructure, and it really is not conducive to have a test that would be amenable to automation. So we think about who it is that we're actually targeting, meaning what kind of hospital, what does that hospital look like, the setting itself, the physicians, the trained specialists they have at that site. And then you ultimately need to really be thinking about adoption, implementation, training. How are you going to scale that training to maybe you're able to get into a integrated delivery network like Kaiser. It's a multi-center system. You train at one site, but it needs to scale to all the sites. How do you do that in a really rapid fashion? It's ultimately creating really simple tests. It is very helpful. And then we do think about education we're very cognizant of the fact that providers are not only thinking about the one test that we're creating, and as a technologist, we have to be mindful of this. They're juggling a million different things. And so constantly being able to educate everybody along the whole stakeholder path is super important when you're developing a diagnostic. And so it's going to be important for what you're all going to be contributing to during this hackathon, but also in general, I think it's just really important to, I think, I look at these big companies like Roche, and the fact that they're able to create a diagnostic in such a short period of time and get it launched, it speaks to the fact that they have deep roots and infrastructure already built into the healthcare system specifically in the US healthcare system, where it's very segmented and it can be very complicated. And so if you end up being able to see an unmet need from your provider and the healthcare system, you find a really good solution, you're able to communicate and get a central lab on board who's ultimately is the body that's going to decide a go, no go if a test is going to come into a hospital. You get the hospital to build the infrastructure needed to train and bring all of the individuals in the healthcare system up to snuff of being able to adopt and implement your test. You get a payer on board. We can take that we'll take it out of the equation right now, but that ultimately then means you have a strong product that's going to create a sustainable business to ultimately shove more money back into creating more diagnostics, right? And so this is the kind of loop that we think about quite a bit, but you cannot think about one part and not the other in the development of a diagnostic. And then we'll complicate the situation even one level further. We have California, we have the Bay Area. I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of different hospitals in the Bay Area and all across California, and every one of them is uniquely different. There's complete heterogeneity and the way that the workflow is operating in every different hospital and then healthcare system. And then now you think about the global world. And exactly what Lisa is saying, that there's not going to be a one test solution for this problem. There's going to need to be many solutions because this is, our global world is quite complicated, and it does take quite a bit of efforts from many different diagnostic entities to ultimately meet the needs of hospital systems around the world. And so I just wanted to kind of leave with this, this use case or this little study kind of here to highlight the way that we think about how the market segments in terms of how the hospital systems that we're targeting and ultimately the types of tests we're designing. So if you do, there's a picture here of like one of our point of care tests that we're working to develop. If in our mind as technologists, we think, you know what, it doesn't matter what the condition is. All of us would, if you kind of picture when people talk about building new technologies for disease, we're always saying cheaper, faster, right, and easier to use. That's what we're always thinking about. But if you look at the healthcare system as it stands right now, and you decided to design a test and you're like, yes, I want it to be point of care. I want it to be run in the emergency rooms because, you know, that's where a lot of emergent things are happening. And we want a turnaround time. We know we want it to be rapid, so we need it to be less than 15 minutes. You design this test, but then you actually look at the healthcare system. And let's say that you have two examples of two hospital systems, and these are both located in California. You have hospital system A, it's a 6-hospital healthcare system, and all of their point of care testing is done in a central lab. Okay, so none of them is done near patient. In my mind, now that I understand the system so well, this is going to be a significant barrier for getting a test like this in the door at this hospital center, because it's very likely that they're not interested in point of care tests being done in the emergency room, and there's a reason for that typically. And so it seems as though it's like a very simple, there must be this problem. There needs to be faster, cheaper, easier test. But actually, if you look at the workflow at this hospital system, it's not conducive for a point of care test. And then we look at hospital system B, which again shows the complexity of the system. This healthcare system actually doesn't do exactly the same thing across all hospitals, and instead only 60% of them are doing their testing in a central lab. But maybe there's this 40% opportunity that is going to be interested in using a test like this. But your market just segmented significantly, and the type of test this test format is only going to reach a very small segment of the market. And so we have to be thinking as we're building new technologies, who and the how these tests are going to be launched and actually work in standard workflow in order to be able to create meaningful technologies. So with that, I'll kind of open it up to any questions.
I would just say that, sorry, can't get my video on, but I think one of the things we have to do, though, is not simply look at the healthcare system the way it exists today, because I think one of the things a pandemic means is that a lot of the rules are now different and changed. And the idea all of a sudden of having virtually all of your testing go on outside the hospital is now very attractive too. The idea of having mobile testing where you could send little cars around to test people, all sorts of things, the idea of increasing the distance between the hospital staff and the people getting tested. And again, the idea of suddenly we need big randomized community level testing as well. And those are all things that, where the rules have really changed very quickly. And so I think we should not, we do have to recognize all of the obstacles that go in terms of getting approvals and reimbursement approvals and central lab adoption and things like that. But, I think that our whole idea of what is a hospital and what is a lab and where do doctors test people and those things, those are all different now. And we have to expand our view of testing to accommodate that.
Can you hear me? Tom Yarish here.
Yeah.
I'm not a professional scientist. I'm an environmental activist, and I've worked with breast cancer researchers and other things related to environmental issues. And what strikes me about your discussion right now is that you need to popularize these tests and in a way that gets it away from this infrastructure, because it sounds like it's going to become hopelessly mired. Mm-hmm. years ago, I was standing in front of a urinal and thinking, my God, what if you could put something in the water, a diagnostic reagent, that what you're standing there looking at yourself, and all of a sudden you get these colors or diagnostic messages in real time, just from a simple urine sample. So diabetics use these acid strips. So, and this would, something like that would take it completely away from the institution of medicine and give real-time feedback to an individual. The other thing that strikes me about all this is you're talking about taking these complex tests on a snapshot basis, a synoptic vision that may be dated a day later. You're getting this narrow sample in time that may not really help you control the epidemic, because your expectation is that at the moment of the test, this virus will be manifest. It may not be. It may come out a day later, and you don't really know, and the chances of you retesting this individual are going to be slight to none. So I'm thinking maybe you ought to find a way to popularize, democratize these tests so that people can do them in the course of a daily routine, going to the bathroom or some other activity that gives them a first line analysis. It may not be correct, but at least they're doing it every day until they do get a positive. How big a challenge is that?
Well, okay, so there's two parts to this, and there's one part that I would love to actually throw back to Lisa to ask her about her opinion, because in my opinion, this is not something, I understand that things are going to have to change, and I think that's where the innovation is going to be happening. It's not even just diagnostics per se, it's the whole shift of building the infrastructure to enable this more remote, decentralized testing. The biggest question we still have is you've got to get providers and the healthcare system on board, because fine, data for the sake of data is not meaningful. Data still needs to be relayed to a physician, to a provider, to ultimately direct care. So the whole system has to be restructured in that way, right? So that's the one issue I'm having right now with I think it needs to be happening now in terms of decentralizing and building the infrastructure to do something like this, but we're not there right now because physicians are barely being able to hold on. They're overworked. They're bringing back retired physicians to be able to work right now. And so how do you get the providers on board? Because you're ultimately going to need them on board to start making this change. So Lisa, that's the first point.
Yeah, I have found that clinicians are the most enthusiastic proponents of having good point of care testing, again, for themselves, so they can know that they're not going to go home and and infect their families, for example. But the thing is, it has to be done right. I mean, I've seen things described as point of care systems, which are giant machines that they wheel into the hospital room, and that's not my idea of point of care. And I think it's important that, for example, being able to take the diagnostic information without having to type it into a computer or have somebody wear Google glasses and retype it remotely or anything like that, to be able to automatically, securely collect the information. It's a simple API to go into electronic health records. We can keep this stuff HIPAA compliant if we need to. And also we can take the anonymized information in their geolocation and provide that data into a repository that then becomes a resource that you can do analytics and real-time surveillance and so on by WHO and CDC and the rest. And so that's our big vision, is that ultimately all the human testing and the animal testing and the mosquito testing and so on can be integrated into a tool that then becomes a real-time surveillance system for pathogens.
Which I agree.
It's not so hard to implement. It's not. There are pieces you have to do it by pieces, but we can.
But I mean, we can't even get the pharmacists to be able to be the ones that are prescribing, right? So that would be the place to do it. Pharmacists already have a degree that are able to prescribe. So
and they can
it could
testing
be
in the pharmacies. They're very interested in moving testing into the pharmacies. We can use all the leftover rooms that Safeway built for Theranos and repurpose them for something actually useful, you know?
But I think maybe that's for Tom, for just to, discuss that one point is I think that it can happen, but it still needs some type of infrastructure. So, I mean, pharmacies are the next best thing. And the UK is really piloting this for urinary tract infections. They're trying to move all their UTI testing out into pharmacies and at-home tests. They actually have an app now that the national healthcare system has rolled out there. So I think that would be, again, but this comes back to government and healthcare systems. It's much more uniformly the same in the UK, which is why you can do certain, I think, more innovative changes than you can in the US. We're just not well equipped to make those kind of iterative changes at the moment, in my mind. That's one thing. But the second point you made about the continued testing. So this gets to the intended use statement of a diagnostic test. Some diagnostic tests should be run multiple days in a row. Like you should be, there would be a need to say, yes, if we're testing for antibody, doesn't necessarily mean that because we don't get it on the first day that it's not happening the second or the third day if you've known you've been exposed. So that does come down to your intended use statement for a diagnostic test, which ultimately defines how that test should be used. And to which the bounds are in terms of how you're directing the use of that test for a patient. And I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with intended use statements, but they're kind of the blueprints really for how we create tests is to ultimately make sure that we're meeting the needs of that intended use statement that we define as the ultimate kind of use case of the test, and directs how physicians use the test.
And so, Tom, I would direct you to look at some of the work by Rob Knight. I think he's at UC San Diego now, but he envisions a future where the microorganisms in your urine and your stool are continually monitored in your toilet. And so that I, as a parent, when my daughter says, can I go over to Cindy's house to play? I can pull up the microorganisms coming out of Cindy's house sewer and I can go, no, I don't think today, honey, maybe in 2 days, because everyone all this information's available and continually monitored out of everyone's sewer system. And we all understand how our gut microflora is interacting with even things like COVID-19 and changing. And so there are people that are thinking about that and trying to figure out how to implement that kind of a future.
It's the testing of municipal sewage has been done previously.
So
studies.
This isn't municipal sewage. This is every single house has their sewage tested.
I understand, but if you want to detect the early arrival of a pathogen in a community, that might be the best place to look.
It might be. And I would just throw to Tara and to Lisa, I mean, I think something that is not coming up in the discussion is the economic equation, because both the UK and Canada and any of those that have a more integrated or single kind of healthcare system, changes make sense because of the financial gain that is made. And I think that is a part of how it makes sense in the United States and drives change as well.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's sort of surprising though to see that as a society and an economy, there have been trillions of dollars lost already, and still there's a sort of attitude of nickel and diming on the most basic health infrastructure. And I would make, that was a point that I think is, Heather made a good point in terms of the economics. For example, to be able to do lots of repeat testing, which I think ought to be easy and available, certainly for healthcare workers who are being repeatedly exposed. It has to be cheap. You know, a test that costs hundreds of dollars is not going to be feasible. And, you know, I think that traditionally in diagnostics, medical device startups and so on, the discussions I've heard on business planning and reimbursement and so on, people are trying to always justify making things as expensive as you possibly can. And I think in this case in particular, we have to follow the kinds of guidelines that you end up working, say, in Africa on a WHO project, that we have to try and find a way to drive the cost of these tests down and make them as cheap as we possibly can. They obviously they have to be, we have to be able to manufacture them and sell them and so on. But I think it's the diagnostic industry as a whole has to take a very different attitude towards the pandemic and the needs of the pandemic than it has traditionally, and not simply view this as a way to make more money.
Well, I'd actually maybe disagree to some extent, because historically, from what I understand, diagnostics have really gotten undervalued in terms of some of them. So oncology, very different. Infectious disease, I mean, time and time again, people always ask, why don't you ever have combinations for anti-infectives and diagnostics? And the bottom line is, if you talk to any diagnostic developer, even during times of HIV and things, therapeutic companies always wanted the diagnostic companies to make the cheapest test they possibly could so they could gift away the diagnostic and charge tons of money for the therapeutic. Yeah. So I think that the diagnostics, I mean, there's plenty of great tests that are selling for $20, $40 per. Calcitonin is a perfect example for the help of sepsis, management of sepsis. That I think the diagnostic companies, I kind of blame a little bit the startup culture to some extent in the way that diagnostics is there, because everybody wants to be $1 billion company. But if you look at the actual economics of diagnostic industry, you can't be $1 billion company. It just doesn't happen, because there's not going to be that kind of reimbursement downstream for infectious disease diagnostics. It's not there. So you have to create affordable.
Over $20 billion a year is spent on infectious disease diagnostics. So somebody is spending money on them.
Yeah. I'd like to see the segment breakdown on that if it's global, but cool. Because I haven't seen those numbers I'm looking at. I mean, if you look at the balance sheets of like bioMérieux, Roche, I mean, they're not making billions of dollars. So it's like, where's that money? Where's that money at?
Hi, Lisa, I just have a question for you. I like your idea. We should test everybody in this community, because this is airborne virus. We have to test everybody. I guess I come here to this meeting just wondering, how can we get a solution? How can we get everyone to get a test?
Well, I think we have to come up with technology that's accessible and affordable and accurate.
Yeah, I will add to that. I called a friend who's working in San Francisco General Hospital and is seeing a lot of the patients. And I asked him, I said, hey, what's your workflow when a patient comes in and they're suspected of having COVID? And he says, listen, there's two buckets. One bucket is, are they healthy? If they're healthy, doesn't matter. I don't even care if they have COVID. I'm not testing them. I'm going to send them home and quarantine them for 2 weeks, right? If they're not healthy, what I'm going to do is I'll take a sample. I'm still going to probably send them home and quarantine them for 2 weeks, as long as they're, okay. And I'm going to tell them to call the 911 if something starts to change in their outcomes. But what he said is they're reflex testing at one of the locations he's also working at, where they do a panel of first an RSV test and some other just kind of common flu tests. And then if it's negative, it goes on, it's reflex to the next test, which is going to be influenza A and B. If that is negative, then it goes to COVID. It's not going COVID first. And so it kind of tells you like their workflow is a little bit different. So I think this would come down to policy. In my opinion, I think it would have to be, you need to test one, you need many tests. I think that's the first thing, but this would have to ultimately be policy driven.
Yeah, I guess we should learn from the South Korea, Japan, and China, how they control this virus, Otherwise, our economy will be down too much, and a lot of people will lose life. That's why I worry about it.
Yeah.
Often, as Lisa said, we need technology. We need for all this key. We need to think about sensitivity accuracy and whatever in that's okay. I mean, I know this group is smart people. Do you have any guideline when it's possible we control this virus?
So I would love to direct people. I can share this link later on 360DX. So I have a PDF version. I can send it out. There's an foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, FIND, in Switzerland. And they were talking about, they have a whole list of all of the diagnostics that are currently in development. I think there's 220 right now around the world. They're, a global entity. And they are very optimistic about the number of tests they have and the different varieties. The one thing that they're really worried about, and again, this brings back the regulatory side, is that there's a worry that you have these tests, but you do have to, there's no way of really knowing their accuracy if you're not getting big enough sample sets. So there are some bottlenecks that are slowing down some of the development because there's only so many agencies or individuals within the FDA specifically to be able to reliably be able to approve something or clear a test and say it's safe and accurate. When you've got so many tests sitting there and they have to go through and assess each of them. So there are lots of tests. That's the thing. It's testing the accuracy and making sure that you are putting something out there for patients that's not going to cause more harm.
Hello. Can I ask a question? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a question regarding the inaccuracy of those diagnostic tests. I mean, especially for COVID-19, but also for other diseases as well. So like how many percentage of those inaccuracy do you see is actually caused by sample degradations or like problem with the concentration?
That's really dependent upon the test, first of all, because it's not every diagnostic specification is created equal. It really depends upon the use case. For example, for a test that you were creating a rule out, you wanted to rule out something, you really want to make sure you have a really strong negative predictive value of your test. But maybe the positive predictive value can take a little bit of a hit. So that is it's a relative, depending upon what your intended use statement is for your test and what the intended use is in terms of how you're going to direct treatment with that test or clinical decision making. That's the first thing. But I know that sample transport from, one location to central labs is a really big problem. It's not something I know tons about, so I can't really speak to it, but I know that this is a complication where, a sample can get thrown, and sometimes you don't even know if the sample sat out for a certain amount of time out on a lab bench and wasn't properly refrigerated. This happens now, even or before the pandemic had hit. It was already there with other patient samples. This happens. So it's one of the things, again, this speaks to, there's diagnostics and then there's all the infrastructure that would help improve the way the diagnostic could impact care if it was there. So I think there needs to be some innovation around transport, sample collection, transport, and then ultimately helping data get to physicians or providers to be able to quickly direct care for patients.
Thank you.
In my experience running water quality tests, there's such a thing as called a chain of custody form. And the labs have a fairly well-defined protocol. And everybody who handles that sample has to sign in and out and then hand it off to somebody else. And our samples were kept refrigerated. And there was generally a maximum time of 24 hours to get that to the lab, and it had to be maintained in stable conditions. I'm astonished to hear that the labs doing medical testing don't meet the same requirements.
They do. That just doesn't mean that there's not human error involved. I mean, it's a reality. I'll give an example. I was a little bit shocked to hear this, but I didn't know this at Stanford Medical System. They have a tube system, right? So samples are sent from one place and they go through a tube to get to central lab. Sometimes those tubes get backed up. Sometimes, things can happen where the transport could take almost 2 hours to get a sample from a patient to the central lab. And that's a sophisticated lab system. You also have systems that have carriers, right? That actually somebody physically walks over, does pick them up, moves them to the next location. But sometimes things are really busy in the central clinical lab and a sample gets set there and it should be refrigerated, but it sits out for some time. I mean, we deal with this in urinary tract infections where urine samples get left out pretty frequently. And it happens. It definitely happens.
I have
and
a
especially
question.
when labs are overloaded.
When there's so many issues with sample collection, storage, and processing, why can the system for infectious diseases sort of, from a diagnostic point of view, be decentralized? Like for type 1 diabetes or even type 2 diabetes, like you have a glucose monitoring system that you could just get home and patients actually take a blood sample themselves and they do this, even pregnancy tests. Like, why does infectious diseases have to be only done in CLIA labs? And, I just don't understand that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, I know diabetes, that's a perfect example of a great at-home test and it's tried and true and it works really well. And I think there's great management in terms of what that information means and how a patient treats themselves. I can't speak across all infections, but I will say I've thought about this a lot for urinary tract infections, and it comes down to a prescriber. So what happens when you get the information, you get a positive oh, I have an infection. What happens next? You need the component of somebody to prescribe you something or somebody to then explain to you, oh, it's a negative, you don't need anything. That's what we're talking about. That part of the infrastructure has to be put in place in order to, I think it needs to be thought out really well. And to be able to deliver it.
I think it's important. I think it's very important for people to know if they're infected, even if they are not symptomatic. Because
for COVID, 100%.
Yeah, you go home, you infect your family, you infect your parents, you infect other people. So, and we can't just accept that because of the current scarcity that we accept that as a norm, that people shouldn't be,
No, I'm saying for infectious disease. The question was generally for infectious disease. Why is it not? And I'm saying it depends on condition. For a urinary tract infection, people unfortunately treat it as though it's not as an emergent problem. And so this is what kind of happens. So there's a little bit of that. So I'm saying across the board infectious disease. Now, it's different for COVID, of course. I think that self-testing would be completely fine.
And I think we should have self-testing for sexually transmitted diseases. Because twice as many people would be tested.
Yeah.
But I think if we go back to sort of the diabetes, I think that's one of the things that is sort of a red herring and confuses conversations is people that are diabetic know it's a live or die situation. They are extremely motivated to learn how to finger prick and test themselves. Whereas so many infectious diseases in our modern era are inconvenient. They're, we feel bad and we want something, we want that magic pill so that we can feel better. There's not so many people, there's not the education that you do die of infectious diseases, of sexually transmitted diseases. And often in the diabetic case, there is lead up to it. There's, they've been, or there's a family history, or there's much more education that has gone around it. Whereas I wake up and I don't feel good and maybe that'll go away. And and it's not the same life or death scenario.
Well, I think the attitude may be changing though now, no?
I think it'll be changing, but I am pessimistic and I believe it's going to fade. This will go away.
I kind of feel the same way, unfortunately.
3 million people are dead in this country. Pardon my...
But I mean, people are dying from antibiotic resistance even more frequently than this, but we can't get prescribers to prescribe appropriately. So you know, it's a conundrum. It's not, yeah. I think this also, there is something that has to be said about culture and the way that the medical system, the culture of the medical system and the way that things operate. There is sometimes pushback because I have heard providers say, no, everything is working the way that it needs to work. Like everything is good. So you have to want change, I think, to be able to move these kind of mountains that are the healthcare system in the US. And yeah, I see some hospitals doing it much better and trying to push things out of the hospital, but then others that are not, that are complacent. So yeah, I think that's something that we have to manage as a diagnostic company, or be realistic of.
I think that the virus is going to change a lot of people's complacency. I think all of what you said would have been absolutely true a few months ago, and that now, at least when I talk to clinicians and ER docs and internists and the like, yeah, nobody is complacent right now.